and thanks to the Beat Museum for hosting us. It's an honor and privilege to be here, trying to carry on with the great baton of the Beat movement here. Years ago, I did a number of films on American Indian issues, 6 films. And the wonderful Native people that I interviewed was Reuben Snake, who my friend Houston Smith called the Dalai Lama of American Indians. That was quite a moniker, right? And he said in one of my interviews with him, life is a matter of finding companions to walk down the road together and helping each other along. And that's how I feel about North Beach, and especially my friend Terry, with whom I've been here over 37 years. We've been meeting at the various cafes as they open, close, open, close, open and close, right? So it was wonderful when he announced that he was going to come out with this beautiful new edition, all right? Thank you for the beautiful new cover, Brandon. Yes. Wonderful new edition. 20 years, it's remarkable to keep a book in print this long, right? And then for the editions to keep getting more and more beautiful. When Terry asked me to write a piece, the forward, it's funny how these things work. I have a kind of a Velcro mind for literary references, but I can't remember where the dishes are in the kitchen, that kind of life. But I remember the minute he asked me to write the forward to this wonderful phrase came to me from a mysterious book, one of my favorite travel books over the years, The Road to Timbuktu. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up in Detroit in the 50s and 60s, Timbuktu was this magical name for an elusive world way beyond the world of Detroit that I grew up with. And I found this biography of a fellow named Rene Caillet, C-A-I-L-L-E, in which he used a marvelous term that I then used for the title of my piece here, called Writing Down the Country. It was his description of what a writer has to do when he or she is moving in strange, marvelous climes. What do? You're taking notes. Taking notes, and then ideally you go back to the hotel room and you turn the notes into a page, and then maybe when you get back to wherever home is, you turn those pages into a book, which is what Terry has done here. So I want to honor him by reading a few pages from my forward here, and then if we have time, a few pages from my new book, Who Stole the Arms of the Venus de Milo, which I just returned from Greece, and I'm very happy to say that the governor of Milos, where she was rediscovered, is reading the book right now. So once in a while, things come full circle, right? So this is my piece, Writing Down the Country. Writing down the country was a memorable expression among intrepid 19th century travelers, as well as a challenge to everyone who hits the road. The vibrant words capture the task of recording one's observations, impressions, and insights while venturing out to see the marvels of the world. That was the original word, by the way, for the 7 wonders of the world. It was actually the 7 marvels, which I prefer. A little aside here. The phrase has been attributed to many adventurers, notably the French explorer Rene Caillet, who became the first European to reach the legendary Timbuktu in 1828 and returned to tell the tale. Others had been there, but they had died on the way home. Taking a journey is one thing, observing it closely is another. Describing it for someone else so that they feel as if they are right there with you is the holy grail of travel writing. The task of the savvy traveler, the essence of the 3-dimensional journey, is finding the right words and images to convey your sensorial impressions to a reader, using all 5 senses in what you write. That's the real deal. For many roadsters, favorite, that's the word I'm trying to revive. It used to be a wonderful word for travelers, roadsters. We'll bring it back together, won't we? An adventurous traveler used to be called, there's a telltale frisson or shiver during memorable travels when a sudden urge comes upon them, the desire to write down their most vivid impressions while they're fresh and original. It wouldn't be too much to say that the true road dog, as travelers used to be called, feels that there's a certain responsibility, even a duty, to do more than stare and gloat and judge other cultures. It's connected with the notion that some of us are blessed by the fates to be able to put on our 7-league boots and explore the back roads of the world, and along with this, the nod of the gods is the belief that we should record our observations as objectively as possible. To just see something with our own eyes may be enough for most tourists, but the chronicler wants to know what it all means, seeks the story behind the story, and to paraphrase the playwright William Saroyan, the chronicler is someone who can't regale others with the stories. You feel that double negative in there? Saroyan once said a writer, someone who can't write. I've always loved that double negative. So, because there's an existential fear that if you don't take the time to tell the tale, it may never eventually happen. Try to capture that sound in your journal tonight. Okay, so I'll go ahead just a little bit here. In the book, Being a Musician, Terry writes beautifully about music, performing music, being inspired by music, and it was uncanny when we met that he had previously told me that Van Morrison, someone that he had listened to quite a bit when he was in India writing this, and it just so happened that I just had breakfast with Van over in Sausalito. So I advisedly slipped this little lyric in there in honor of Terry and Van together. His own soundtrack redounds to Van Morrison's cosmic album Astral Weeks, especially the title track where the Bard of Belfast sings, "If I ventured into the slipstream between the viaducts of your dream, could you find me? Could you kiss my eyes? To be born again, to be born again, to be born again." Y'all remember that song?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, we're about the same age with this, right? So in the service of this numinous desire to be born again, the Bone Man of Benares is a genre bender, a mosaic of travel writing, memoir, love lore, musical passages, and praise singing, humor and humility. No small accomplishment in a book that focuses on one writer's life. Consider the way that Terry writes about Asia, where he spent many years. You never know what's going to happen in India. Nothing in India is as it seems to be. Seeing so, Terry reveals the task of the great travel writer in the latter-day memoirs, which is to go beyond the surfaces, to cut beneath the crud of tourist brochure promises and the glare of trendy claims of paradise found in your local airline magazines. If you don't, you run the risk of only piling up the miles and crumbling your passport with exotic stamps. Often while reading these pages, I found myself thinking of Tarnoff as an old-school chronicler, a marvelous word rooted in chronos, the Greek word for time, and referring to a mode of writing about the time in which we find ourselves and wanting to remember. This thought took me orthogonically, a great adverb by the way, to the ritual of planting time capsules. All vivid travel writing can be thought of as a mini time capsule. If we can't remember where we've buried our time capsules, have you read the statistic? There is an association, American Time Capsule Association. We can't find 95% of the time capsules that we planted in the 20th century, into the 21st. There's a metaphor in there somewhere. Joni Mitchell paving over paradise, somewhere in there. That's staggering, isn't it? We can't find our own time capsules. However, we can find travel writing, memoirs that are travel capsules. Since The Bone Man of Benares first came out in 2004, a number of readers have written to Terry, saying what every author secretly longs to hear. The way he writes about the old hippie trail, well, I was there too. And you know what? That's just the way it used to be. We long for lines like that from our readers, don't we? Considering his lifelong fascination with doppelgangers, our personal counterparts, the centerpiece of the book is his encounter with a certain bone man, a character who combs through burial ashes on the shores of the Ganges in Benares and sells bits of those bones to make a living off the dead, a lifetime of memories, you might say. The well-earned epiphany in these pages comes when Terry realizes in one searing moment that he himself is the bone man. This is a startling admission, of how his travels and his writing about them are similar, figuratively speaking, to the bone man's job. The author's tasks, I think, is to find the bare bones of experience and somehow save them in our own language. And while feeling those feelings that we're trying to preserve, excavating the place, Terry sees the best epiphanies of this marvel-filled book, the name of an old lover, her name spelled out everywhere, his quote, in every song, every poem and painting, as if destiny was trying to tell me something. I think it was. The fates were telling Terry Tarnoff that it's his destiny to travel to these mythic sites and be there when he was there, to feel these experiences in their depths, their glories and their sorrows, their loneliness and their ecstasy, and then help us to feel it too.
Oh,
Thank you, Terry. And now just a couple pages, page and a half or so from the Venus book, which 20 years in the works. I'm happy she's out. It's well worth the ride. I'm beginning with in this passage near the end of the introduction, in which I described this haunting phrase for me that someone named Rebecca Elson, who was a British astronomer turned poet, has used. She talks about how the scientist and the poet has a responsibility to all, which is a startling phrase for any scientist to use, but it's at the heart of her work. So I'm writing a bit about that here, and then I do a kind of movie cut to Athens, 1975. The Greek army's tanks roll into Syagma Square to thwart the gathering protesters. With all the hotels and hostels closed, I wander up to the Acropolis with my orange backpack and sleeping bag and a copy of Henry Miller's The Colossus of Melusi, one of the great travel books of our time, right? Under a full moon, in my Spanish Bota bag full of Greek wine, I wander into the open ruins of the Parthenon. The nearly 50-year-long restoration wouldn't begin for another month, July 1975. That night, there were no guards, no fences, no watchdogs, no other midnight visitors. Spreading out my sleeping bag on the rough stones of the floor of the mighty temple, I felt what Miller calls the stillness, the heartbeat of the world. I read to my utter delight and surprise that Miller had felt the same cosmic pulse when he was in Greece. The heartbeat of the world, that's what I'm trying to capture in these pages about the Venus de Milo. I remember that night the moonlight gleaming on the marble columns all around me, the shadows flickering on the rough-hewn floor, the fallen pediments, and the slivers of ancient statues. Considering the around-the-clock security nowadays that swirls around this ancient holy site of the Acropolis, it seems incomprehensible that I had had this gift from the gods, but I did. I slept that night inside of the Parthenon, alone, in a rapture, in love with life after returning from the horrors of growing up in Detroit. Yes, I actually write this, where I had worked 4 years in a steel factory. So this was quite something. Hoping to stretch the moment as all travel writers do from here to infinity. I stare up at the miraculous marble columns of Athena's temple gleaming with moonlight, and I think back to the summer before I was working the night shift at the factory in Detroit. Now, the same moon is blinking down on me, on the empty boxcars, the sleeping forklifts, the police cars. Lying on my back, in the time-gnarled stones of what used to be the smooth marble floor of the Parthenon, my heart is pounding out of wonder and fear, and I feel a transcendent shiver being seized by joy. Okay. There it is. What I think Terry Tarnoff captures in all of his novels, the secret strength of beauty. It's a phrase from Dostoevsky. which has the capacity to bring us back from the deadening, the numbing, the torpor of our unlived lives. We go to art, architecture, literature, and music, as we used to go to church, to remind us that we are capable of more than savage acts, more than destruction, to help us recall that we are capable of acts of creativity and beauty worthy of the gods, which is what Terry has given us. Thank you very much. Just a warm up for Terry.
Are you caught up in the...
And now everybody, Terry Tarnoff.
Terry Tarnoff!
Thank you. Phil, listen, if you people have not read any of Phil's books, please. How many is it? 45 books now?
Oh my goodness.
I've written 4 books, which have nearly killed me. Phil has written 45. The last one, Who Stole the Arms of the Venus de Milo, is absolutely brilliant. The previous one, The Lost Notebooks of Sisyphus, is absolutely brilliant. On and on we go. You can pick any one of them and they're fantastic. And thank you so much for writing the foreword to this book. Much appreciated. And Brandon, thank you so much for doing the cover of the book, which I think everybody loves very much.
Yes. You can design my next book cover.
The Bone Man of Benares came out 20 years ago, and it was just across the street at City Lights that was the first reading, and some of you here were there, which is amazing to me. I'm glad that you're still alive. I'm glad I'm still alive. And since that time, I wrote another book about this era, which is called Once Upon a Time Goa. So the two books really kind of interweave with each other. In terms of the Goa book actually starts earlier in 1965. First went to Europe, and ends in 1978 when I came back and moved here to San Francisco. The first truly exotic spot that I went after spending a couple of years in Europe was Kenya. And I'm going to read you a little section from there. You know, in the 1920s and 30s, and this kind of relates to Phil's forward, tourism around the world was really just for the rich, and especially to exotic places, because to get there was very difficult. You had to take a ship usually, and those ships might take months and months. And of course there were the odd adventurers, but mostly the people who were on the road back then were retired rich Americans. And especially after World War II, when America, of course, was very rich and Europe wasn't. And so the world was kind of inundated with rich Americans, hence the ugly American. And this went on until really kind of the late 1960s, when suddenly airfares to Europe became very, very cheap. And there was a new interest. So many of us were so incredibly disillusioned with America and even with Europe that we went out seeking something different. And we found that in places like Kenya, places like India, Nepal. And for me, I checked into a funky hotel and was lulled to sleep by the sound of a harmonium and a man's plaintive singing in the distance. I fell into a dream world of the 16th century where a sailor sang from the deck of an ancient dhow. I awoke the next morning to find 34 mosquito bites covering my body. With 1 in 7 mosquitoes said to carry malaria, I prayed that my quinine pills were working. And then came the rain. I'd heard plenty about the monsoon. Just the sound of the word made me feel damp. Monsoon simply has too many O's in it. And I always imagined a deluge slipping right through the letters themselves. The heavens didn't so much explode. It was more as if the hands of God just shoved the sky away, so there was nothing left to hold back the water. It rained for 36 hours straight, never wavering in intensity, just a massive downpour that kept coming and coming and coming. The sewers backed up by noon, the streets flooded by night, the sidewalks washed away by morning, and then it rained some more. The mosquitoes stared out the window and just laughed at the rain. They also laughed at me. So, who's the white guy? Dunno, he just flew in. You check him out. Last night, the shoulder's not bad. Yeah, I tried the ankle. And I've had worse. What'd you think? Check out the neck. You're on. Meet you over there. I bet you never knew that the mosquitoes in Kenya have English and Hungarian accents. When the skies finally cleared for a minute or two, I decided to take advantage of the opportunity to find drier ground. East, west, north, south, it didn't matter. The middle of the ocean would have been drier ground. As no buses were headed for that particular direction, however, I chose to go north because, well, there really was no because. The road from Mombasa to Malindi was reasonably intact, but then the nice tarmac road ended and I found myself on a broken down bus bouncing along nothing but a dirt track. Because of the monsoon, the road was a series of endless potholes with whole sections washed away. As we pushed further from Malindi, the Western-style clothing of the city gave way to customary tribal dress, and it seemed like we were traveling back in time. A woman with 8 inches of metal rings around her neck sat next to me for a while. Then came a man with ochre and beads matted into his hair, and later an old lady with earlobes that stretched her shoulders. About halfway to Garson, 100 miles due north and slightly in from the coast, the driver jumped off the bus, bought a little bundle of what looked like tree bark, and began it. The old lady sitting next to me giggled when I pointed at the bundle, then opened her eyes wide in a trance-like stare and said, "Cot." The driver shoved a big wad of cot into his mouth, chomped down, and seemed to get energized for the next leg of the journey. Like, really energized. As we came barreling around a curve in the road, he saw a family of baboons and did what any red-blooded, amphetamine-crazed guy behind the wheel would do. He tried to run them down. Suddenly we're flying down the road. He's got his pedal to the metal. The baboons are tearing ass ahead of us, turning back with these big red eyes and enormous fangs and shrieking like crazy. And suddenly we're up on the banks of the road trying to nail one of these 100-pound blurs of fury. And now we're off the road. And this guy is nuts. The bus is shaking and creaking. Some man with a bone through his nose is stomping on the aisle across from me. A kid is leaning out the window trying to grab a mango we're about to crash into. And the baboons are really getting crazy now, but not as crazy as the driver, who's having mad ancestral visions as he bears down on the animals. And suddenly I hear a clunk. And then a clunk. Oh shit. He fucking hit one. A cheer goes up among the passengers like they're at the Green Bay Packers. And then suddenly, another clunk, clunk, clunk. Oh God, I can't stand it. And now the baboons are completely freaking out, running up the hills, climbing up the trees, leaping into the bush. And then, all of a sudden, just like that, we're back on the road. The driver's yawning. The guy across the aisle is totally sound asleep. The kid is munching on his mango. And it's like absolutely nothing ever happened. 2 dead baboons, blood all over the place, monkey skin hanging off the fender. Absolutely nothing happened at all. The bus wound up to the end of the road, which was some mysterious place a mile into the Indian Ocean called Lamu. Well, Lamu was truly like going into the 16th century. There was no electricity on the island. There was no running water. There were no roads. There was no cars. There were no motorcycles. There were no telephones. There was no radio. There was no television. There was nothing. It was as if it was truly the 16th century. It was one of 3 sultanates along the coast of Kenya, which are areas that were developed by the Arab traders about 500 years earlier. And those sultanates are Lamu, Mombasa, and Zanzibar. Lamu was the smallest of the 3 and was known as kind of the poetic place, the literary part of East Africa. When I got there, sitting in the port, docked in the port, a dhow. Now, dhows, you probably know, are these huge ancient ships that are very wide, and they have a forward-leaning mast, which is the thing that's always is a dead giveaway. And it used to be that there was nothing but dhows in the Indian Ocean, that all of the trade was done even from Africa to India and up to the Persian Gulf. It was always by dhow. And when I arrived, sure enough, there was one of the final dhows to make that crossing. The thing with dhows is that it was only the sail, and the dhows would come down and then have to wait for 6 months for the wind to change, for the monsoon winds to change. So they would bring down spices and rugs and so on, and wait in port for 6 months, and then bring back mangrove wood and dried fish. So here was this dhow, and I finally had to go visit these guys. And there were probably 30 or 40 sailors on it, just hanging out. And we somehow communicated. I'm not quite, I spoke a tiny bit of Swahili at that time, and they spoke a tiny bit of Swahili. And somehow or other they said, "Come with us. The winds are changing, come with us to Abu Dhabi." I said, "Fuck man, what is Abu Dhabi?" I never even heard of Abu Dhabi, but I was ready to go. Unfortunately, I found out that I was going to have to go to Nairobi to get a visa for Abu Dhabi. And there was no way in the world that they were going to give me a visa to Abu Dhabi. So I wound up instead spending 7 months on this magical island. And it was truly a life-changing and life-affirming place for me. After that, I returned to Mombasa. I played with an African band for 6 weeks. I was incredibly lucky to meet a woman from Tanzania who was a citizen of Tanzania and had a little car with Tanzanian plates. And therefore, we were able to travel anywhere in East Africa, that, including all these places where the tourists were not allowed to go. So we spent nearly 2 months in the bush, going through much of Kenya and Tanzania, which again was phenomenal. I've left there and went on to Madagascar and the Comoro Islands, Mauritius, and finally back to Mombasa, and then an 11-day journey from Mombasa to Bombay. Bombay is the most international city in Asia, home not only to hundreds of sects of Indians, but also to Iranis, Iraqis, Yemenis, and Afghanis. But then, scratch beneath the surface, and the truly unusual can be found. Because Bombay is where borders blur, where passports disappear, where Interpol washes its hands. Bombay is the home of the aberrant, the fugitive, the outsider. Bombay is the Polish concert pianist who fled the Nazis 30 years earlier and has lived underground ever since. Bombay is the Peruvian revolutionary wanted for the assassination of 18 hostages. Bombay is the Saudi emir getting cancer treatment at Breach Candy Hospital and his harem of 20 wives camped out at the Hilton Hotel. Bombay is the Russian technocrat who slipped out from the embassy one night and disappeared into an opium den on Sukalachi Street. Bombay is the Jewish exile from Shanghai who prays at the Indian synagogue every Friday night for her long-lost family. Bombay is the Tibetan refugee monk counting beads on his mala while trying to cross Karnak Road. Bombay is the Belgian antiquities dealer hiding a 1,000-year-old bronze in a shaving kit. The Dutch banker living high off absconded funds in Malabar Point. The German religious fanatic doing ecstatic dance to Lloyd Chaitanya in the hallway of his hotel. I slipped into Dipti's fruit bar for a mango lassi. I'd been in Bombay for maybe a week at that point. "You new here then?" asked an Englishman who was wearing purple pajama pants, an embroidered vest, and a wool skull cap. Is it that obvious? "Oh, just a wild guess. What'd you think so far?" "I don't know, man. It's a lot to take in." "Well, don't forget first impressions and all." I'm trying not to jump to any conclusions. Yeah, the first days in India, it's hard to figure out what to make of it. It took me 6 months before I thought I had it down. Then, a year later, I realized I knew less than before. I've been here for 5 years now, and I'm just getting back to where I was the first 5 days. I looked at him incredulously. "You've been here for 5 years?" "Yeah, give or take. If you're interested in trying to figure out this place, I'd say get out right now, before you get all muddled up." Thanks, but that's probably very good advice. But you're not going to take it. Probably not. I didn't think so. You've got that look. You're going to have to go through the whole cycle, just like me. I took a sip of lassi and laughed. Well, I'm pretty sure I won't be out here for 5 years. The Englishman just smiled. "You never know what's going to happen in India. Nothing in India is what it seems to be." 5 years later, as I was about to leave India, I was back in Bombay, and I realized the guy was right. Different ideas of what India is, what Nepal is, what all these places are. I had grand ideas, grand insights into everything, and it was all wrong. It was exactly I saw the first 5 days that I had come back to 5 years later. With winter coming, I decided to head north for the Himalayas to Manali in the Kulu Valley. Manali was known to have the best hashish in India, so that seemed like the logical place to go. Manali lies between two steep mountain ranges, and the sun doesn't rise until 10 and sets around 4. I decided to walk higher into the mountains in search of the marijuana fields. There was something magical in the air. The sky was crystal clear. The snow-capped mountains loomed magically above, and a path seemed to beckon me into the woods. I thought I heard flutes in the distance, and was certain my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I continued on, the sounds became clearer. They were flutes, all right, and sprightly flutes at that. I wandered off the path, came upon a clearing in the woods, and stood there a moment, unsure of myself. Finally, I pulled back a branch and saw, sitting in a large circle, 20 Tibetans. I'd heard there were Tibetan refugees in the area, and now finally I was actually seeing them. The first thing I noticed about Tibetans was that they didn't sit in very orderly circles. In fact, to call it a circle at all was stretching it a bit. It was more of an unruly squiggle that vaguely connected as it curved around. The next thing I noticed about Tibetans was that they didn't really sit in the classic meditation position. In fact, their posture was much closer to what I. The third thing I noticed about Tibetans was that they seemed to have a fondness for a milky white liquid that was being ladled out by the only woman in the group. And as they sipped from large bowls, I began to get the suspicion that, hey, wait a minute here. They were dead drunk. Not just drunk. No, these, my first Tibetans, the most spiritual of all people, were knocking back one shot of chung after another and were rip-roaring to the wind fucked up. I couldn't remember reading about this in my Buddhism course at the University of Wisconsin. Then they noticed me. Come, come, sit here next to the honored spot next to our patriarch, they seemed to be saying. So I followed their welcoming waves, crossed the clearing, and approached the old wise man. He smiled at me, motioned for me to sit, and then as I began to kneel down, he grabbed my balls. Whoa, Kimosabi, this definitely wasn't in that Buddhism course. Or was it? I remembered how I didn't really understand the terminology. Twist, twist, someone started yelling while pointing my way. Hey, who do you think you're calling a twist? I was about to say, but then I began wondering, what exactly is a twist? Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe it's their greatest honor, like great white man from across the many oceans. They all started yelling, twist, twist, until some red-faced guy pulled me right to the center of the clearing. In a way that wasn't so bad. I was glad to be away from the ball-grabbing wise man. But just what the hell was I supposed to do now? Then the guy started moving his arms back and forth, real stiff-like, and shaking his hips and moving his feet. And he's like, oh no, a Tibetan chubby checker. You want me to twist? I asked incredulously. A big roar of approval erupted. Twist, twist, they kept yelling. And suddenly we're on our feet and we're doing some insane dance to a happy flute. They're pouring chung down my throat, the vilest, most potent hooch this side of the Ozarks. And we're floating around the dance floor like drunken egrets. Everybody's arms are outstretched, and almost imperceptibly, the Tibetans began flapping them like wings. Their heads bobbed up and down, their knees bent slightly, and then the flapping increased a little. Me right along with them. Me and 20 Tibetans, and a woman whose father had just died. And we're flapping his spirit away. We're drinking to his memory. We're dancing to the good old days. We're flapping and floating and flying at 10,000 feet. And I'm starting to really like my first Tibetans. They've got a certain style. And I'm warming up to the idea that come what may, we're gonna twist again, like we did last summer. Winter was fast coming in, and I was on my way to Nepal, and got there about a month later. This was 1973. Now, Nepal was the end of the road for most of us. A lot of people had set off for Asia from London or Paris or maybe even Istanbul, and most didn't make it past Afghanistan if they got that far, maybe Pakistan. A few got to India, and then a very few made it to Kathmandu. And the people I met in Kathmandu in 1973 were the most incredible people I've ever met. The most unusual, the most artistic, the most distant people from the West. In fact, one day I was looking at a map, and Phil grew up in Detroit, I grew up in Milwaukee, and I realized that if I was to leave Milwaukee and go as far as I possibly could on the planet, I'd wind up in Kathmandu. I had done it. I had finally gotten as far from Milwaukee as possible. One of the people that I met was a man named Angus MacLeese. Angus MacLeese was a drummer and poet from Greenwich Village who took it upon himself to study the most esoteric Buddhism while drumming out rhythms so convoluted they were nearly impossible to decipher. Years earlier, Angus had hooked up with Lou Reed, John Cale, and Sterling Morrison to form the original Velvet Underground. They first met on a subway in New York, where Angus pounded out wild polyrhythms as the train screeched through the tunnels. That's where Angus was most comfortable, in the subway stations, bus platforms, and train terminals, where he could absorb the sounds of the city and add his own particular touch to the surrounding cacophony. Playing with an actual band, unfortunately, was another matter. Angus was famously late to practices, often showing up a day or two behind schedule, if at all. Lou Reed remembers Angus this way. One day we got a job, and Angus said, "You mean I have to show up at a certain time, and then I'm allowed to play, and then I have to stop playing?" And we said, "Yeah, man, it's a gig. That's what a gig is." And he quit on the spot. What can I say? This was the 60s. That was Angus in a nutshell. New York was too small for his anarchic spirit, and the rules too strict. He left for California in search of a gig that began in the evening, ended in the morning, and never required him to play the same thing twice. When Angus arrived in San Francisco in the mid-60s, he met a woman named Hetty McGee, an extraordinarily eccentric Scottish woman. And it was love or something at first sight. And shortly thereafter, they were in Golden Gate Park being married by Timothy Leary. They soon left for Arizona, where they lived on a Navajo reservation, and then found themselves in southern India with, at that time, their 2-year-old son, Ossian. One day they were paging through a brochure, and Ossian saw the Monkey Temple, which is a famous temple in Swayambhu, right just outside Kathmandu. This is the temple, you've probably seen pictures, that has the eyes painted into the side of the temple that kind of overlook the whole valley. So they're looking at this photo, and Ossian says, "Gotta go, gotta go, gotta go." And sure enough, a couple of months later, they wound up in Nepal. Not only did they wind up in Nepal, but they wound up living in a little broken down house just behind Swayambhu Temple. Now Ossian kept looking at that temple, looking at the monks. He was intrigued by something. He kept looking, kept staring, kept always wanting to go over and hang out with the monks and the other little kids. And Hetty, when Ossian was about 4 years old, decided he was going to become a monk. So she put him in the temple. And suddenly, 4-year-old Ossian is wearing maroon robes, has kind of a shaved head, is speaking Tibetan, much better than English, and is totally thrilled to be there. Now Hetty started thinking, there's something really special about this child. He's not just a monk. He's a very special monk. He might be even a tulku. Now, a tulku is, in Tibetan Buddhism, a monk that has been reincarnated from a very high monk. And of course, that makes them very special. So Hetty started thinking, Ossian is a tulku. Ossian is the reincarnation of some very, very high spiritual leader. So she wrote a letter to the Karmapa. The Karmapa was in exile in Sikkim. And just like the Dalai Lama, who was in exile in Dharamsala, these were the two main spiritual leaders of Tibetan Buddhism. And she wrote to the Karmapa and said, I think my son might be a tulku. Well, it just so happened that the Karmapa was coming to Kathmandu for the first time in over 20 years. And he agreed that he would give Ossian a test to see if this was real or not. Now, the Karmapas coming to Nepal was an unbelievable event because, as I said, he was in exile from Tibet, and the Tibetans who were still in Tibet, when they found out that their leader was coming to Nepal, hundreds of them escaped over the mountains. Now, in these days, this was still completely, the Chinese soldiers, guarded the border very carefully, and if you were caught trying to escape, you would be shot on the spot. But hundreds of them came in the fall. Even Papa was coming the next spring. But in order to get there, because of the snow, they had to come 6 months earlier. So there they were in groups of 25, 30 people. And one of those groups was just maybe 100 yards from where I lived. And I would, whenever I was walking to the village, I would pass through this group of Tibetans. These people had never seen a white man. They had never seen an automobile. They had never heard a radio. They had never seen a newspaper. They were from the easternmost province of Tibet called Kham. And they were very primitive looking. They had round, flat faces. They looked kind of different from most Tibetans. And they would sit out there all day long pulling wool and to be woven into carpets later. And if the moon was full, they would be out there all night long because they could do it by the light of the moon. And I would walk through this group and they would look at me like, what in God's name is that? And one day I was walking through and I heard some kind of a commotion. And I heard crying. And I went over and I saw a little girl had nearly cut off her finger with the shears as she was pulling the wool. And this was, I mean, the worst thing imaginable. If you couldn't use your hands, you were finished. And everybody, no one knew what to do. Everybody was panicking. And I was with a friend, and we, through sign language, got the girl and her mother and took them down to the main street of the village and put them in a taxi, which of course they had never been in a car before. And we went off to the hospital. Well, they had never been to a hospital. They'd never seen a doctor. They had no idea what was going on. They were absolutely terrified. And the poor little girl, her hand is bleeding like crazy. The blood is gushing out of her finger. And they don't know what this guy's doing with the needle and the whole thing. But he sewed her up. And we got them back to the village. Just out of curiosity, about 4 years later, I was walking down that same main street in Swayambhu. And I felt somebody pulling on my sleeve. And I looked down, there's some young girl, I don't know who she is. And she's, kind of trying to gesture something. And then finally she puts her hand out. And I see all of the stitches from 4 years earlier. And under her arm was a big pile of books. She was off to go to school. Now back to I think I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent here.
Not for sure.
Not the first time.
Not the first time.
So now we move forward to the spring, and the Karmapa is finally coming. And hundreds, probably thousands of people have gathered on Swayambhu Hill because he's flying into the airport and then he's going to drive in this motorcade and he's going to come to the Swayambhu temple. And so here are all of these Tibetans waiting 6 months, but really waiting 20 years to see their spiritual leader. And he's supposed to arrive about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So there we are, hundreds, probably 1,000, maybe 2,000 people, including some Western Buddhists who had flown in from New York and from London to see the Karmapa. This is a big event. So 1 o'clock comes and we're waiting, and no sign of the Karmapa. Okay, fine. So we're waiting a little bit longer, 1:30, 2 o'clock, no Karmapa. 2:30, 3 o'clock, no Karmapa. What's going on here? 3:30, 4 o'clock, and all of a sudden, 3 Tibetan women went into a trance and started doing this bizarre sexual dance. Now, for a Tibetan woman to do anything of this nature in public was unheard of. They're very modest people. But they were gyrating and in some kind of an ecstasy. And the other Tibetans kind of, looked at them a little bit and kind of moved them out of the way, got them into the back of the crowd. And we're still waiting. It's 4:30 now. Where's the Karmapa? And finally, somebody yells out, way in the distance, we see the cavalcade of cars coming from the airport. And now the excitement is unbelievable. And it takes another 30 minutes or so for the cars to get there. And then they're down at the bottom of the hill and we can't even see them anymore because of the trees and everything. But we're hearing Tibetan horns. And they're building and building, right? And everybody's starting to freak out. The Karmapa's coming, right? And we're waiting and we're waiting and we're waiting. And suddenly, the sun goes down. The full moon comes up. And the Karmapa shows up at that instant. The Tibetans are very cool.
Dramatic.
And surrounding the Karmapa were 4 huge monks, like sumo wrestler huge, right? And they were all carrying these special umbrellas that you may know of that the Tibetans have. And they're carrying these umbrellas, but the thing is, they're trying to keep people away from trampling the Karmapa, because to touch the Karmapa is a great honor. And they know that, so it's this crazy dance where they want people to be able to touch the Karmapa, but, not so much that he's going to get smothered by them. So these 4 monks are kind of... Meanwhile, the Tibetans are going and they touch the Karmapa and they're going to ecstasy. The Westerners, they would touch the Karmapa and then they'd go back again and again, figuring, hey, the more blessings I can get from the Karmapa, the better. Anyway, the Karmapa finally goes into the temple and people disperse. And then later, it's time for Asya to go meet the Karmapa. Now you maybe have heard of the Dalai Lama, the way that he was chosen, which is that they searched throughout Tibet, through the little villages, and they finally found this boy that they thought quite possibly was the Dalai Lama. And what they do is they apparently they place a series of cups and bowls and eyeglasses and stools which had been used by the previous Dalai Lama. And the idea is that if this child chooses the right ones, well, that will tell you that's the Dalai Lama being reincarnated. And apparently, that's what happened. Because after a while, the doors open, Asyan comes out, and they say, he's a tulku. That in fact, this high monk had reincarnated this kind into 3 separate beings. And one of them was Ossian, the first Westerner to be declared to be a tulku. There was a rumor that the mother of a tulku would go crazy and the father of a tulku would disappear. Hetty was a bit odd, let's say, and Angus disappeared. Until we opened a bookstore, the Spirit Catcher bookstore. We had a Spanish translation of the Bhagavad Gita and an Amharic version of the Tropic of Cancer, a Mahout's guide to Sri Lankan elephant commands, a Swahili translation of Mao's Little Red Book, a book of mountain climbing tips written in Braille, a compendium of long dead currency conversions, copies of the Tibetan Book of the Dead in Egyptian, and the Egyptian Book of the Dead in Tibetan, Kiro's Language of the Hand, Aleister Crowley's Magical Diaries, Madame Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, the complete works of Hermann Hesse, minus the missing pages, Kazantzakis in the original Greek, Dante in the original Italian, and a book of Russian fairy tales in faded Cyrillic. Ira Cohen, who about 15 years ago sat over there and gave a magnificent poetry reading. Ira and Angus oversaw a publishing house out of the bookstore called Bardo Matrix, and put out poetry journals that were printed on handmade rice paper and illustrated with woodblock prints. Among others, they published the works of Paul Bowles, Gregory Corso, Diane de Prima, and William Burroughs. And it's funny to be standing here right now and feeling this strange connection about this screwy little bookstore at the end of a dusty path in Kathmandu, Nepal in the mid-1970s, being really connected to the Beat Museum in its own way. Thursday night was the weekly poetry reading, and the bookstore was packed. Ira read from the Cosmic Crypt, Angus read from the Cloud Doctrines, and Roberto Valenza read from the Clearing Stage. As Roberto alternated lines of poetry with atonal Indian chants, I filled in on guitar while Angus played a rhythm that was completely beyond comprehension. He'd gone beyond polyrhythms and improvisations into some whole other realm that eclipsed music. Whatever I was playing on guitar and whatever Angus was playing on drums had absolutely nothing in common. He was jamming with an astral quartet in some unknown plane of consciousness, while I was left to play mere chords on guitar. Angus wasn't playing rhythms. He was stealing shapes from a multidimensional universe, little pieces of trapezoids and octahedrons that flickered together for an instant, then flew off into some far-gone exosphere, never to return again. It was Thursday night. It was Kathmandu, and the whole of the universe was in that room, roiling around, giving birth to stars and nebulae, dissolving into black holes and dark matter, and starting all over again one more time. Now, Ira was known for many things. He was a magnificent poet and a spectacular photographer. And one of the things he had developed was the use of mylar, which was this kind of aluminum foil type of foil, which NASA had invented, I think when the rocket ships were coming back into Earth orbit, this was to keep them from burning up, something like that. So it's this very, very powerful, but extremely thin, strong foil. And Ira got his hands on some of this stuff and started shooting photographs off of the mylar. And he had a whole series of these. He had a studio in Greenwich Village, and one of the most famous people that he photographed was Jimi Hendrix, which you can see if you look on the internet. You can find Jimi Hendrix seen through mylar. He also shot William Burroughs and any number of other people. Ira had a consort named Petra Boat. Petra was a legendary German actress who was being groomed for the classical stage in Berlin. And then one day the Living Theater came through. And Petra saw their performance and ran off at the Living Theater. Petra was every bit as impressive as Ira, maybe more so. The Nepalis thought that she was Kali, the goddess of death. And when I first met her, I did too. She was absolutely terrifying looking, dressed in black, purple, and silver with this thick, thick makeup. Nobody wore makeup in Nepal, except for Petra. And she had this austere kind of way of standing, and oh my God, everybody was terrified of Petra. And when I was once invited to their house and she answered the door and she said, "Can I get you some tea?" And I found that Petra was a very gentle person. They lived just behind me in a big house that was filled with books, paintings, poetry, photography, bat skulls, raven beaks, and a collection of human toes and fingers that Petra had purchased in India from the bone man of Benares. When Ira met Petra, an artistic force was unleashed upon the world. They were two outsized personalities draped in purple, black, and silver, two alchemists of the netherworld who poked holes in preconceptions and mutated reality. It was only natural that they would wind up in Nepal, the perfect stage for their surreal explorations. The day that Ira and Petra found out I had hepatitis, they hurried over with sheets of mylar and rolls of film. "You're magnificently yellow," cooed Petra. "It's a wonderful shade, completely inhuman. You must be part of my new collage. Please just lie back. Let the shadows sink into your glorious skin. Is it too light in here? Ira, do we need to close some windows? Oh, this is good. This is really good. You are so wonderfully gaunt. Who knew you could project such luscious morbidity?" "Congratulations," said Ira. "You're going into our gallery of rogues, misfits, and international outlaws." "I'm honored," I said. "You should be," said Ira, angling one final shot of my jaundiced visage against a sheet of mylar that was twisting in the breeze. "Don't ever change." We have a moment more. I'm going to finish off with something about Benares, since it is called the Bone Man of Benares.
That's right.
I mentioned the University of Wisconsin, where I studied. I was supposedly studying psychology. And each night I would sit down with this book about, I don't know, experimental, something about, you know, monkeys and tests and all this shit. What, it was horrible stuff. I wanted to study Freud and Jung, but no. They were into monkeys and gorillas. So I would be sitting there with this book at night, and I'd be paging through, and oh man, I don't know, you know, and it's too bright in here, I think, you know, so I would put on a little softer light, and yeah, I don't know, I think I need some music though, you know, so I would put on Ravi Shankar. And well, that kind of calls for some incense and a joint. And next thing I knew, I'd be floating off, thinking about what seemed to me to be the most exotic possible place in the world. Benares, India. Just the name of it. As Phil said, Timbuktu had a certain magic. Kathmandu had a certain magic. But for me, Benares had a certain magic. It was 3 a.m. It was the dark of the moon, and I could hardly believe I was there. I walked down a few steps and saw the reflection of a half-dozen fires in a broad expanse of water. This was it, the Ganges. As I stood there, a slight breeze kicked up from the smoke, and the smoke from the fires blew directly into my face. It was strangely sweet and acrid. As my eyes began to focus on the dancing light, I heard the sound of shuffling feet and turned to see two men carrying a simple bamboo stretcher. I saw something that looked like a package lying between the poles, wrapped in plain white cloth. Then noticed the outline of a foot underneath. It was then that I realized I was at the Burning Ghats, the Hindu cremation grounds. That each of these fires was fueled by human flesh, and that the smoke blowing up into my nose was the putrid stench of death. I saw more stretchers on their way to the river and imagined a whole trail of them, dozens, maybe hundreds, all lined up and ready to go. More smoke blew into my face. I shuddered and was turning away from the fires, feeling a little ill, when I heard a familiar call, Bom Shankar. I looked over toward one of the ghats and saw a group of sadhus lighting up a chillum. I wasn't sure, but it looked as if one of them was waiting for me to join them. I instinctively backed away. I mean, you remember the ball-grabbing wise man. But then he waved again, and it occurred to me how perfectly insane this would be. To smoke with sadhus the very first time right on the burning ghats of Benares. As I walked toward the Duni, their ritual fire, I felt my stomach clench up. 6 sadhus were gathered around, and they made room for me to sit cross-legged in the circle. The chillum came almost immediately my way, and they all watched to see if I knew how to smoke the chillum. I took it with my right hand, held my left hand under my elbow, and touched the chillum to my forehead. I took a long, deep hit, managed not to cough, then handed it clockwise to the sadhu on my left and tried not to fall into the fire. As the chillum went around the circle, I slowly exhaled and became aware again of the body burning on a ghat just a few feet away. I glanced over and saw a charred leg sticking out between the pieces of wood, and a hand pointed straight up. Then I heard a magnificent voice, a deep tone that was both comforting and compelling. And I turned to see the oldest sadhu in the group, speaking to me from across the dhuni. He looked at me with penetrating eyes, and I felt myself being drawn into some other world. He was speaking Hindi, and I didn't have any idea what he was saying. But I sensed that something important was being communicated. Some piece of wisdom that, if only I could grasp it, would change my life. I nodded to him, not to pretend that I understood, but to indicate that I appreciated his efforts, that his words meant something to me, even if I didn't know what they were. That I would try to live up to his message, whatever it might be. The smoke from the chillum, smoke from the dhuni, and the smoke from the body all blended together, and something, I'm not quite sure what, made perfect sense. Another Indian was invited into the circle, and he squatted next to me, while the old sadhu, a beautiful man with a mile of hair and flowing white beard and orange stripes painted across his forehead, took such a massive hit from the chillum that a flame briefly burst forth from the hash. I glanced at the guy sitting next to me, and we smiled at the sadhu's prowess. I was really getting into it now, grooving with the holy man, feeling like I somehow knew more than I did an hour ago. Even getting used to the idea that there's a dead body being cremated a few feet away. And the smoke is furling all around, and the chillum is coming my way, and the guy next to me takes a big hit and hands it to me. And the guy next to me takes a big hit, and he hands it to me. And my fingers clasp around the stem of the pipe, my hands and the guy's hands and the chillum and the smoke, all mixing into some kind of moody impressionist painting. And I notice something. And then I look again, and I'm not sure if I'm really seeing right. But this guy doesn't seem to actually have all of his fingers. They're more like stumps. And then I look once more. Shit. He's a leper. And I try to be cool. I'm smoking with sadhus after all. And okay, so I'm touching his stumps. Maybe that's not so bad. But then I'm wondering how he even got his hands around the chillum, and I'm thinking he must have had his lips right against it. And then it all starts making sense. This must be some kind of a test from the sadhus to see if I can take it. Well, of course I can take it. And I grab that chillum and put it right up to my lips and take a big hit and hold it in. The hash, the germs, the smoke from the dead body, the leprosy. And then I feel something fall to the ground, and I glance down, and I can't really tell for sure because it's nearly pitch black. But as my eyes began to focus, I'm a good 90% sure that it's his finger. I fucking pulled off the poor leper's last finger when I grabbed that chillum. Oh man, I'm sorry. And he's looking up at me like, don't worry, it's okay. And I want to say to him, no man, it's not okay. I feel like shit, I don't know why I grabbed it like that. And then the gad attendant comes by and turns the body. And the old sadhu adds some more wood to the dhuni. And a stretcher passes by with yet another corpse. And even though I feel absolutely terrible about what happened, it just seems like it's too late to do anything about it. It's too late for the leper. It's too late for the corpse. It's too late for India. And as I take another hit off that chillum, it more than likely is too late for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for,
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you.
and 20 years from now,
Congratulations.
We'll do it
we'll
again.
do it
Yeah.
again. Thank you.
Oh,
With Stella's puppies.
Stella.
That's
Thank you, Stella, for coming too. Stella,
Stella, you made it.
you made it. Oh, she's gonna come say hello. Oh, give us a kiss. Give us a kiss.